In episode 1, we understood the company. In episode 2, we drew the boundary. Remember the scope? Now we ask a deeper question. What reality sits around that boundary? Because the environmental management system does not operate in isolation. So it operates in a context, and that context is not neutral. Now, by the end of this episode, participants should understand that context is not generic background, be able to distinguish internal versus external issues that matter, and understand the role of environmental conditions, the 2026 emphasis, and connect context, scope and interested parties, aspects, risks, even policy. Okay? So avoid the typical pastel slide with no consequence, and avoid the long list of internal and external issues. So anyone who has ever heard me talk about context characterization in webinars has heard me say that I see many companies entering a kind of competition to create the longest list of internal and external issues, and how that is wrong. Okay? So let's go. So in many systems, context becomes a document. A list of political, economic, social, technological factors, sometimes copied, sometimes updated once a year, but rarely used. And that is the problem. Okay? Context becomes something we describe, not something we use. The standard does not ask the organization to produce a long description of its context. It asks for something more useful than that. It asks the organization to determine the external and internal issues that are relevant to its purpose and that can affect its ability to achieve the intended outcomes of the environmental management system. Think about this, okay? Again, so it asks the organization to determine the external and internal issues that are relevant to its purpose and that can affect its ability to achieve the intended outcomes of the environmental management system. So you don't determine internal and external issues in a vacuum. No, it's by reference to this, okay, to the intended outcomes of the environmental management system. So let's slow that down. External issues are factors or situations outside the organization that can influence results. Some of them can make it harder to achieve what the organization is trying to achieve, including desired results, results it wants to avoid, and legal compliance. Others may create opportunities, so conditions the organization can take advantage of to improve performance or to make the system stronger. Okay? And that is important because external issues are not automatically positive or negative. Their significance depends on the organization, on its activities, its context, and what it is trying to achieve. Now, internal issues work in a similar way, but from the inside. They are resources, capabilities, conditions, or limitations within the organization. So, some internal issues support the organization in achieving the intended outcomes of the EMS. Others make that harder. For example, weak processes, lack of competence, poor data, limited resources, or fragmented responsibilities. And in practice, external and internal issues do not operate separately. They interact. So together they increase or reduce risks and opportunities related to the intended outcomes of the EMS. So the key word here is not simply issues. Okay? The key word here is relevant. And relevance is not theoretical. Okay? Relevance means, does this issue have the potential to influence our performance, so our compliance, or our ability to achieve the intended outcomes of the system? Now, in episode 2, we saw that scope influences context. So if your scope is narrow, your context will also be narrow. If your scope includes external activities, suppliers, or life cycle stages, your context expands. So context is not independent. It's already shaped by the boundary you choose. And now we need to explore that context in a structured way. Context includes both external and internal issues. External issues include environmental conditions, regulation, and expectations from the market, for example. Internal issues include how the organization operates, its processes, its capabilities, and its constraints. But again, not everything matters, only what affects environmental performance or the ability to manage it. Now, this is where the 2026 direction becomes more visible. Okay, so environmental conditions are no longer just part of the background. They are explicitly recognized as something that can affect the organization and be affected by it. Okay, so context is not just about business and regulation. It's also about water availability, climate patterns, ecosystem sensitivity, local environmental pressures. So these are not abstract topics, they are operational realities. Now, let's go back to BlueRiver, okay? So we already suspect that water will be central. Now we make that explicit. Production increases in summer, exactly when water may be less available. Cleaning cycles increase, so increasing water use and wastewater generation. Local water bodies may be sensitive to discharge, and regulators may pay attention. So, water is not just an aspect, it is part of the context. Once we recognize water as part of the context, the next question becomes very natural. So, what risks and opportunities emerge from that reality? And here, the answer is no longer abstract. So, if production increases in summer, exactly when water may be less available, one obvious risk is water scarcity at the very moment the business needs water most. That can create operational disruption, constrained output, increase costs, and put pressure on planning. Then there is wastewater. So if cleaning cycles increase, wastewater generation also increases, and that raises the risk of variability, non-compliance, or stress on treatment capacity. And there is also reputational and regulatory exposure. If local water bodies are sensitive, and if regulators are paying attention, then a water-regulated problem is not just a technical issue. It can become a compliance issue, a community issue, and a credibility issue. But context does not only reveal risks, it also reveals opportunities. So the same reality can push the organization to improve water efficiency, reduce losses, optimize cleaning practices, reduce wastewater load, and become more resilient during periods of scarcity. And it can also strengthen credibility with regulators, customers, and other interested parties. So this is the key point. When water is part of the context, it's not just something to describe. It becomes a source of risks and opportunities that the EMS needs to determine and address. Okay? And this is the key idea. Context is not a description. It's a filter. It tells you what matters, what may become significant, what requires attention now. Without that filter, everything looks equally important. With that filter, priorities start to emerge. So when context includes environmental conditions and external dependencies, something else happens. The system naturally expands. So you start to look beyond the site. You start to consider life cycle stages, upstream, downstream, external providers. So this is not because of a theoretical requirement. It's because context makes those connections visible. A very common mistake is to create, I already spoke about this, a long list of issues, political, economic, social, technological, but without any connection to the system. The result is a document that looks complete, but does nothing. Context is not about completeness, it's about usefulness. Okay? So, a practical way to approach the determination of context is to do it in two passes. Okay? In the first pass, I suggest focusing on environmental conditions. Why start there? Well, because environmental conditions exist independently of the organization's strategic direction and independently of the intended environmental outcomes of the EMS. They are part of the reality in which the organization operates. So the first questions are, what environmental conditions surround us? What do we affect? And what could change? That gives us an initial determination of context anchored in reality. Okay? But I would not stop there. Later, after determining environmental aspects and after defining environmental priorities and objectives, I would return to the determination of context. And then I would ask a different question. What in the internal and external context could help or hinder those priorities and objectives? So, in this approach, the determination of context is not a one-time exercise. It begins with environmental conditions, and then it is revisited in a more focused way once the EMS has clear priorities. Another interesting thing is this: context and interested parties are closely linked. Okay? So environmental conditions create expectations, expectations create pressure, pressure creates requirements. So you cannot separate context from interested parties. So they reinforce each other. And now we connect forward. Okay? Context is not the end of something. It's the beginning of something. So it will directly influence how you determine environmental aspects, how you convert interested parties' expectations into requirements linked to compliance obligations, how you evaluate risks and opportunities, how you set objectives. So if context is weak, everything that follows will be weak. Okay? Now, if we go back to this diagram from episode 2, you can see that context is not isolated. It interacts with scope, with interested parties, with policy, with risks and opportunities, and then flows directly into the determination of environmental aspects. And that matters, because environmental aspects are one of the places where context stops being background and starts becoming operational. This is not a sequence of isolated boxes, it's an iteration. Context helps shape the system, and once the system begins to define its aspects, priorities, and objectives, that in turn changes how the context is read and determined. And let me close with this idea. Context is not what surrounds the system, it's what shapes it. So if you treat it as background, it will remain background. If you treat it as a decision input, it will start to change the system. Okay? So in episode 4, we'll take this context and move to the next step. determining environmental aspects, but now with a much stronger foundation.